Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about something that arises quite frequently and in a variety of different ways in Japanese and causes quite a lot of confusion because of the rather strange way it's taught in conventional Eihongo English language Japanese grammar. And this is the word morai, which is used in all kinds of different contexts and can be very confusing and difficult for learners to grasp what's actually going on in these sentences. Now, part of the reason this is so confusing is that morale is customarily grouped together with kureru and ageru, as if the three belong together and worked in the same kind of way. And to a point, this is true, but dealing with them in this way is actually more confusing than it is helpful. Quite a while ago, I dealt with kureru and ageru, and at the time I quite specifically didn't include morale, because I believe teaching them together in the way that is common causes a great deal of unnecessary confusion. I'm going to just run quickly over kureru and ageru now, and we'll talk about the ways in which they are similar to morale, the much more important ways in which they aren't similar to morale, and what we should really be comparing morale to, which will make it much easier to understand a whole range of Japanese expressions and sentences. So, as we know, ageru and kureru mean respectively give to someone else or someone else, giving down to oneself or to one's in-group or someone one identifies with. It can refer to giving an actual object, a present or something, or it can refer to giving an action, doing an action for the benefit of another person, or another person doing an action for one's own benefit. And before we move on from there, I just want to make a little point that people sometimes misunderstand, and that is that while giving up and giving down are originally honorific regarding the other person as higher than oneself, as it were, this origin is so old that it's almost lost. So, in a way, despite its honorific origin, we could regard it in a more neutral way, rather like uploading and downloading, downloading meaning towards oneself, uploading being towards someone else. And the reason for that is that ageru is not, in fact, honorific, and it's generally considered rude if you use it to a superior when you're talking about an action. Because shite ageru means doing for the benefit of someone else, doing someone a favor, essentially. So if you talk to a superior in such a way as to imply that you're doing them a favor, this is going to cause offense. So we should not regard ageru and kureru as being actually honorific or humble. They're not keigo. Kureru can imply gratitude, but it doesn't imply humility, and ageru doesn't imply honoring the person to whom it's applied. Right, so now let's move on to morai. Similarity to the others is simply that it does represent downloading. And while kureru is as it were a push download, someone else taking the initiative to download to you, morai is more like a pull download. And that really is about where the similarities end. Because morai works in many ways very differently from kureru and ageru, and much closer to something else which we'll come to in a moment. When you use morai with a noun, receiving something, it doesn't necessarily imply a particular giver at all. If we say, 1,000,000 o moratta, the same, I got 10,000 yen. The implication is that it came from somewhere, it was given perhaps by someone, or at least it came very easily. But we're not saying anything about who gave it to us or where it came from or how it all came about. Unlike kureru and hageru, which are bound to a particular giver and receiver. Now when we're using it with a verb, mora contrasts strongly with kureru in that kureru implies that the giver took the initiative, whereas mora, the emphasis is on the receiver, implies that the receiver took the initiative. It's sometimes translated as, I got someone to do something. And that isn't a bad translation in some cases. It can also refer to getting a service, which of course you take the initiative, you pay for it, that kind of thing. And I'll come to that in just a moment. Let's notice that if no giver is mentioned, then no giver is necessarily implied. When a giver is mentioned, the giver is marked by ni. Now, this is exactly the same as the receptive helper verb, neru lareru, because mora, like neru lareru, the receptive, the so-called passive form, which is not passive at all, both of them are in fact about receiving, aren't they? So they're what we may call pull sentences rather than push sentences. In a push sentence, the ni marks the indirect object, the ultimate receiver of the action. So, if we say, Mary ni bore wa negeta, we're saying, I threw the ball at Mary. The ball is the direct object, what I threw. Mary is the indirect object, the ultimate receiver of the action. In a pull sentence, where the receiver is the ga marked actor, then the ni marked person is the ultimate giver, the ultimate source of the action. So it's actually much more useful to compare Munalo to neru lareru, the receptive helper, because it does almost exactly the same thing. It takes a verb, adds another helper verb to it, which tells us that the action is being received, and the actor of the sentence is doing the action of receiving the action from somebody else. And this similarity, this likeness between mora and neru lareru is not pointed out by conventional Japanese grammar, although it's really by far the best way of understanding it, because of course they confuse the whole issue by calling the receptive neru lareru helper passive. It's not passive, it's receptive, just like mora, and they work very similarly. The difference between them is that neru lareru implies that the action just happened to us. We may or may not have wanted it, but it wasn't really our doing. Mora implies that we took the action, that we actively brought the action upon ourselves from somebody else. We got them to do it for us. So let's talk about receiving a service. A very, very common expression is Oisha-san ni mite morae, which is translated in dictionaries and English grammars as see a doctor. And this is a terrible, 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 irresponsible translation. I don't know why they do this exactly. I think it's because they feel that a likeness to a common English expression makes it easier. It doesn't make it easier, it makes it much harder because it confuses your entire perception of what's going on here. Oisha-san ni mite morae doesn't mean I will see a doctor. It means I will have a doctor see me. I will get examined by a doctor. Now we can see this much more clearly if we're talking about hairdressing or haircut. Senpatsu, there's hairdressing or haircut. And if we say senpatsu or shite morae, we're saying, have someone cut my hair. Oisha-san or mike morae, have a doctor look at me. examine me. So you see the two working exactly the same way. And we can also see that while with Koisha-san we're specifying a giver, with Senpatsu or Shite Morale, get one's haircut, we are not specifying a particular actor. Someone might say, Senpatsu or Shite moratta hou ga ii, you should get your haircut. But it's not saying anything about by whom. It's not saying, well, they want you to go to the hairdresser, or when you get your big sister to do it, it doesn't matter. Just get someone to touch your hair. And this leads to another very important point, which is that the actor of morale, the person in morale, does not have to be the speaker. And by comparing it to kureru, a lot of people get very confused by this, and then they get extremely muffled when they see someone referring to someone else other than themselves. Morale. But there's no rule against this at all. You can't use kureru for someone who isn't either yourself or the member of your in-group. Or, for example, in a novel, it could be a character because the writer is allowed to be inside the head of the character. So kureru is tied to a person or an in-group, but morale is not. We can freely talk about other people moraling, receiving something. Now, another important area that confuses people terribly, but we're ready to deal with this now, is sasete morale, which is a combination of a causative helper verb with moiai. And we now know enough about the logic of morale to deal with this, but we're going to need to learn a little bit more about the logic of the causative helper verb, seru faseru. So rather than make this lesson very complex, I'm going to deal with that in the next lesson. So please be here on that. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. Korekara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Trust is breath.